So, okay, we're just gonna breeze through the first couple of slides again since we're just starting. This is my 101 presentation I put together for the Garden Center here a couple of months ago. And I was just telling everybody this is how I actually grow my orchids. The freestanding greenhouse was made out of redwood. So the frames are made out of redwood, so they're very unlikely to, be bothered by pests and all that stuff. And what we actually did is I've got an airplane hangar, and I actually built the trusses in the airplane hangar, built the first one as a template, and then made 6 more of them. And then we hauled the thing out frame by frame and put it up. And the last thing that went up was the polycarbonate, and we're about ready to change some of that out as a hailstorm kind of put some holes in it. And then like I said, the greenhouse tends to get a little bit too warm in the summer for a lot of things because the fans are going, the misters are going, all that stuff, and it's still 120 degrees in there. So some of the cooler growing stuff I actually grow inside my bathroom. I found this really cool looking pyramid plant stand, and I've got my vanilla kind of crawling all over it. And then actually I've got some on the other side too. So there's actually quite a few plants in there. And thank God I had a whole bunch of them in there when we had the cold snap, because my big greenhouses looks horrible right now. So here's what we're going to cover today. So, what makes an orchid an orchid? Like I said, Doug's a taxonomist. If you want to get down to the genome or whatever, I guess he's the guy to talk to. But according to the Oregon Orchid Society, it's one of the largest flowering plant families on the earth with over 30,000 species. So huge population of orchids. They're found almost on every single continent, even Antarctica. And the one variety of orchid that grows in Antarctica grows and blooms totally underground. Wow. So unless you accidentally dig it up, you won't even know it's there. But they're just about everywhere. And they say that the plant family goes back about 84 million years. So what is that? The Prozoic or what? I don't know.
It's old.
And it's the orchid flower rather than the foliage that is developed in a specialized way. So all these orchids that have the tubes and all the funny little nuances to them, they've evolved that way usually for a specific reason, to attract a pollinator, so forth. They say the vascular system is not nearly as developed as other plants. And the pollen is considered very primitive. Orchid pollen is almost like dust. And then the seeds are almost like dust as well. So they really they produce millions and millions of seeds in the seed pod, but only a few ever probably find the right, the habitat and whatever to grow. So this didn't turn out too good.
Yeah,
so there's
big screens.
Yeah, it wasn't a high enough resolution thing. I'll have to find a better one. So orchids tend to be either monopodial here or synpodial. I mean, monopodial here is synpodial. And it's just the way the bulbs are. Every year, a new stalk, a new bulb comes up with new leaves. Where a monopodial, like your Vandaceas, they just keep growing up, and up. Every once in a while, they'll shoot off to the side and create another plant, but they usually have to be very, very large. So these are really easy to propagate. These not so much. And then, like we talked about, the orchids, flowers, what's really specialized. So you've got these sepals, 1, 2, 3, and you got the petals, and you got the labellum. So that's generically the parts of an orchid. Sometimes in some of the different varieties, the petals and so forth are almost microscopic, but this is generally what we look at when we're looking at an orchid flower. Some of the more common orchids, you know, you pretty much see these at the Walmarts and the big box stores and all that stuff. These are the Phalaenopsis. They're considered to be the moth orchids. They're supposed to look like a big moth. Then we've got the Oncidiums Alliance, tend to look that. And then the Dendrobiums. And the Dendrobiums are the long cane kind of plants. So if you see the long canes and all that stuff, primarily they're going to be Dendrobiums. Here's the Cattleya. These are the queen of the orchids, the corsage orchids. So if you ever have one and you want to make a corsage out of it, the night before you want to use it for corsage, cut it off the plant, stick the whole plant and put the whole flower and the stem in a bowl of water in the refrigerator, and that'll harden it up. So that otherwise, if you just snip it off and pin it on, it'll wilt within minutes. But if you actually want to use it for corsage, you know, do that. Sometimes you can get the actual tubes, the floral tubes, stick in there, but just cut it off the night before, set it in a saucer of water, and it'll firm up. So that's how you take care of those. Here's the bandaceous kind of orchids we see. And here's the Cymbidiums, and we've got a perfect example of a Cymbidium. These are usually available around Easter times, a lot of times in the stores, the big box stores. And the nice thing about Cymbidiums, they don't really like a lot of heat. So I'm kind of thinking the next time I grab some Cymbidiums in the summertime, I'm just going to pull them out of the greenhouse and put them in my porch. Yeah. Where it's a little shadier, a little cooler, and I can water them, you know, keep them a little cooler, because they tend to be a little bit cooler. One of the biggest places to find Cymbidiums is the California coastline, Santa Barbara and all that stuff. They grow these things by the millions in buckets like that. And they use them a lot for cut flowers and so forth like that. Nice thing about Cymbidiums is they tend to take cooler temperatures. You can actually grow these things down near freezing. So you really don't have to drag them in at 50 degrees like everything else. So these are kind of cool, but they don't like a lot of heat. So he's got a cool greenhouse. He can keep those temperatures, you know, a little more temperate. Okay, you get the tags, you get these plants, and you see these tags with all, yeah.
Slide, can you go speak to this one?
Yeah.
The third one, how much light do they require?
They take a lot of light. So they take lights like Cattleya is pretty bright light. And I've got a slide that kind of talks a little bit about light, but they're fairly light. Vandas, one thing about Vandas is they don't have the bulbs. Oh, so these guys have got to be watered really, really often. So if you got Vandaceous, plan on watering them a little more frequently. Like I said, it only has that one little stalk. It doesn't have all these bulbs to store nutrients and water. So these guys, make sure you, a lot of times in the Florida and all that stuff, they water them every day. So okay. You see these name tags and it's like, oh my God, what does all this mean? Well, it's kind of important when we're doing the registration for the shows and all that stuff to have all this and have it correctly. But one thing right here, this is the family. The genus is the family. So this is Phalaenopsis. Usually we abbreviate these things. So the Phalaenopsis are these guys, okay? And then the next is either the species or the cross. If it's a species, it'll start with a small letter. So that's the dead giveaway. If you see a small case word here, if it's done right, then that means it's a species. If it's a capital like this is a hybrid. This is a cross between two or more. And there's probably could be dozens of parents in this thing. And then the next is kind of a variety. So sometimes you'll see like alba, which is a white form of something. So a lot of times you'll have like Lalias or something like that. They'll be typically lavender, and every once in a while you get a strange fluke or something like that, and you'll get a pure white form or something. So that's what these things tend to come out to be. So these are variations of this. And that's kind of, and then the next thing is, if you see something in quotes with like this AMALS, That's an award. That means the plant's actually been awarded at a judging center. Now, if it has little quotes like that and no award, it just means it's a cultivar or a specific cross and variant of one grower. So a lot of times people will, Brian puts his little Byron or whatever on everything he has. He creates, even if it isn't awarded, he'll put Byron or something on it just to say that where that plant came from and that it's a unique plant from all other plants. And there's a whole bunch of awards. This is Award of Merit. There's FCCs. There's cultural awards. There's a whole slew of awards that can be awarded to an orchid. And there's different, AOS is probably the largest in the United States. There's the Royal Horticultural Society in England. It issues awards. I think Orchid Digest issues awards, don't they, I believe? Or not? I don't know.
Japan, New Zealand.
Yeah, there's different orchid groups around the world and so forth like that. And they don't all follow the same rules for their, how they award plants. And so down here, this is a Phalaenopsis cross, Dawn Trader. The variety, since it's an awarded plant, you get to name it. So if you take your plant and you go to the judging center and it hasn't previously been awarded and you get awarded, you can call it Bill. Or Charlie, or whatever else you want. A lot of the orchid organizations, the growers will use their company name or whatever like that. And I was just talking to Alex about the orchid jungle, and I said if you see something with jungle or something in the hybrid or one of these variety names, this probably came from the Fennel Orchid Company in Florida. So that's what you're kind of looking at with your tags. You got to try to be careful when you're repotting that you don't get a whole bunch of plants and tags all scattered, because the tags need to stay with the plant. So especially if now sometimes you go in Walmart or whatever, you see a pretty plant and there's no tag on it.
Yep.
If you like it for the flower and you like the color, fine, you just grow it for that. You can still enter it for a ribbon at our shows, but it can't be pulled for AOS judging. Any questions about the Greek?
What exactly is Rex mean?
Undergone trade. Trader.
Correct, it's a cross.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It's a cross. It means it's one or more. It could be primary crosses is like when you take two species and put them together, and then they get more complicated if it's a cross from a cross of a cross of a cross. So
I think it means they made a whole bunch of that hybrid.
Mass produced.
So, and I'll talk about, well, we'll see which one it is. So if you ever see the blue orchids in those stores, guess what? They're not blue. They've actually squirted this flower stalk with some dye and created it blue. So pretty much if you buy a blue orchid, unless you really go spend a lot of money for one from a reputable dealer, it's probably going to be white the next time it blooms. So,
They would do that trick with rabbits too.
oh, you have pink rabbits.
No, seriously, blue rabbits, like you put food coloring in the water long enough, they'll all turn blue. It's the weirdest thing.
I would be running if I saw a blue rabbit coming at me. So I was mentioning earlier, Oklahoma actually has about 20 different varieties of orchids, but most of them are like little things like this. This is what comes up. This is what comes up in my front yard every year about the tail end of summer, early fall. These things pop up and it's amazing. One week they're there and the next week they're gone. And these are the sporanthes, and they're called sporanthes because they spiral. And that's the easiest way I can tell you. If you go, I'll make an announcement or something like that, or we'll send something on the page when it's time to go looking for these things. But they just pop up there underneath my my oak trees in the front yard, and they've never seemed to come up in the same place twice. So obviously there's a long dormancy period, and every once in a while these guys just decide it's my time. And The slipper orchids, these are more found over in the southwest in the forest kind of areas. I've seen these things in Rich Mountain, over just across the border. And these calgopogums, these tend to be kind of marshy kind of things. So, these you can find here. And,
Yeah,
what happened?
it's going forward.
So, yeah, so that
There we go.
there.
Oh, I had another slide. I guess it didn't show up. Okay, well, it didn't, on my slide I had after this actually showed the disbursement of the plants across the county. So, okay. You know, I talked about, you can grow these things in a greenhouse, put them on artificial lights, or even if you have just a bright sunny window. If you got a window that faces kind of east or southeast, your Phalaenopsis moth orchids, they'll grow right next to your African violets, pretty much. So, you know, artificial lights, we've got a light meter that you can check out. So, okay. So if you check it out, just be sure to bring it back next meeting so someone else can look at it. You can actually measure and see what's going on. The one thing I can just tell you about artificial lights, if your plants are green and growing, but they don't bloom, you're probably not getting enough light. So orchid plants that really, they look kind of yellow green. And that's usually when they mean they're getting a lot of light, and that's usually when they're going to bloom. But, you know, give it a try. Not everybody can. Oh, I did post out on our Facebook page some greenhouses that were sale on Facebook if anybody was interested. Here's my big thing. When I see this, I just about want to, I want to puke. Orchids do not like, orchids are tropical in general. So this putting cold ice on them is, you know, not a good thing. So general requirements for growing orchids, they like to be in a loose medium. That's why if you put them in dirt, unless they're a ground growing orchid, they're going to die because you're just choking the roots. Medium to bright light. Water typically at least twice a week. If you're got them in a greenhouse, it's August and it's 105 in the shade, you probably got to just about have the misting system going all the time. Fertilizer, typically when it's growing, I just use Osmocote, the little BB stuff that you can get. And I put like a teaspoon in a 5-inch pot. So I usually just use that. And that usually is sufficient. But you can get the orchid specific fertilizers if you want.
And do you water twice, do you fertilize twice a week when you water, or do you just fertilize once a week?
I use the Osmocote, and it's a slow dissolve little like BBs. You just put them in there and they're good for like 3 months.
Oh, okay.
They dissolve about 1% a day or something like that. So when they start growing, I just walk around and put a teaspoon in almost all the pots. You got to kind of be careful when you're doing fertilizer like that. If it's a real small plant in a small pot, you don't want to put too much in there. You're likely to burn them, you know. Orchids like continuous air movement. You saw the picture of my greenhouse. Well, there's actually 2 ceiling fans in there. They've been running for 20 years. Never turn them off. You know, and most motors, just tell you right now, most motors, they're going to die when you turn them on, turn them off. If you turn things on and leave them on, they'll probably run for decades.
Yeah.
So
I have the same thing with computers.
yeah, same. Oh yeah, we've got test systems out at Tinker. Every time they try to turn them off for the weekend to save energy,
Yeah.
then they spend 3 days trying to get them to run again.
That's exactly right.
So continuous air movement. So I don't have a fan in the bathroom, you know, there, but in the greenhouse, there's definitely continuous fan movement there. And it's also good in the greenhouse because it helps stabilize the temperature because, you know, with the greenhouse, you get your hot and your cold spots in there, and moving the circulation will keep the air more, you know, homogeneous throughout the whole environment. And the overall temperature, generally orchids don't like to be much below 55. And they don't really like temperatures much above 85. They will sometimes hang in there at 100 degrees or whatever. They don't like it. So we do the best we can with what we've got. So here's kind of the light situation. You can, I don't know which, that probably that meter's smart enough, you can program it for whatever units of measure you want, but your moth orchids, the phalaenopsis and phaps and the jewel orchids that I like to grow, pretty low light environment. You know, a sunny bright window will do. You get into the pragnopediums and dendrobiums and epidendrums, moderate light, highlight of your cattleyas and say your cymbidiums. And the van is like a lot of light, highlight. But you got to be careful. If you're gonna give them the highlights, you better give them the water or they're gonna burn up. So one of the other big things is, well, how do you propagate them? So you want a nice plant like that, you can either self it by itself or cross it with something else if you want something different, get a seed pod. And these things have to be grown in a laboratory sterile environment. Orchid seeds on their own. Cattleyas come from South America. Say there's 1 million, 2 million seeds in there. If the wind blows those seeds, maybe 1 or 2 might actually develop into a plant. But you can have much better success with these things, growing them in a lab. And you'll see them sometimes in the shows where you can buy them in these little baby bottles. They've already been moved probably once or twice to get to this size.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Why do you think it is so difficult for them to multiply in nature? I mean, what's stopping them from landing in a good medium and just growing?
We already talked about the orchid seeds themselves are like dust. Okay. Most seeds that we get, there's usually some kind of protein or nutrient surrounding those things. So they've got a medium to grow in or get started. Okay. Orchid seeds are just barely, I think, the embryo themselves. And, you know, they have to hit just the right microorganisms and so an environment to grow. That's why they produce millions of seeds so that, you know, hopefully a few will hit the proper conditions and grow. So this is seed propagation is one way to do it. Then there's mericloning. This is cloning. And a lot of times when we get orchids, they find the ones they like with the best color, the best growing conditions, health issues and so forth like that. And they come in here and that little bud that comes up first on the bottom of the plants or whatever, right here, this is the April meristem. They cut this thing up, they chop it into pieces, and they put it in this, like a petri dish with the right kind of growing medium, and they sit there and shake it. Sometimes they put it in a liquid. It just depends on the method they're using. They sit there and shake it, continuously shake it. And what happens is since the plant doesn't have an up and down reference for gravity or whatever, it just keeps growing like in a clump. When these clumps get big enough, they take it up with a knife and they chop it up in little pieces, put it back in here, and grow it like this. So the deal about a mericlone is, generally speaking, if you mericlone, you'll get that exact same flower. It should be pretty much, what is it, 99 point whatever chance that it should grow just like that. And what happens is all the babies from a mericlone carry the same award. So if your plant was an awarded whatever, and you clone it, all the babies carry the same award. So that's why, you know, growers and so forth, they find a particular variety that they think people will appeal to people. And they'll produce thousands of them. So that's cloning. Okay, repotting. So if you're gonna start repotting, you're gonna need a torch, you're gonna need some heavy pliers and some shears.
Everything but the torch, baby.
Yeah,
Very helpful.
yeah, you need that because you have to sterilize your instruments.
Oh,
Because if you start chopping into plants and you chop into several of them with the same cutter without sterilizing them, you risk the chance of passing along a virus
do
or
you
something.
like fire better than alcohol?
Yes.
I am a firebug. I just like fire.
You like-
Dainty and use the creme de,
Yeah, use your kitchen torch.
Right?
You can get these things down there and now you can get them with the little electronic starter that you don't have to do the flint thing to start them. So the only problem is you keep heating these knives and eventually you take the temper away from the steel. So they start looking pretty crummy after a year or so. And okay, repot. Well, wrong way.
There we go.
So potting medium. I saw a guy one time, member of the Orchid Society 30 plus years ago, grew orchids. He had one plant he grew in marbles.
Whoa.
Marbles. So for the most part, we don't really get any nutrients from the potting material. It's just something, a media for the plant to grow in. So, I mean, you've got the different kind of things. This is tree fern up here. And there's sphagnum moss. And I mean, there's different kinds of barks. I tend to just kind of mix them, take some bark and throw in a little bit of perlite and maybe some clay pellets kind of stuff, just as a variety of things, because they want a loose kind of soil. But you just got to figure out what works for you. I mean, what works for Doug works fine for his greenhouse the way he's got it set up, but may not be so good for you. So you got to figure out what works for you and then don't change it. If the plant's growing and happy and flowering, don't change it. And same thing with the pots. You can get the orchid pots with the holes in them. You can get the plastic pots with the slots in them. You can use baskets. Whatever, nice thing about this, you can put a rail across somewhere. You can hang a whole bunch of these things over a bunch of other plants. So baskets sometimes are kind of cool for space saving or recovering additional space. And you can even plaque things. Bill was using cork bark for the plants he's got on here, but you can also use this tree fern bark. This is getting harder and harder to find, but you can plaque things. And then don't forget your labels and wire and stakes. Those are other supplies that you're going to need. So when is it time to repot? When the plant starts growing out of the pot. So once it starts doing this stuff, it's time to repot. And sometimes your little phalaenopsis or something might actually start growing a baby plant off of one of the flower spikes. You can actually remove this and plant that up too. But we usually say you want like 3 roots and have the roots about 3 inches long before detaching it from the flower spike and planting it on its own. So those are kind of the conditions for when to repot. And also it's good to repot when the plant's actively growing, not when it's dormant. So when it starts growing, you see the new roots coming out and you see the new plants start coming out. As soon as it's the time to repot. You have to be careful with these new growths because they're very sensitive, easy to knock off. So, kind of shake it loose, pull it out of the old pot. Trim off maybe some of the old dead roots. Make sure you sterilize your instruments. So if they're green, white, or green and fleshy, those are pretty good. But if they're kind of dried, wilted, you could remove those. And if you've got a big plant, like this, see this one slide turned out fine. Yeah. So they usually say you want about 3 2 to 3 bulbs with a new growth coming. So here's a choice where you can just split it kind of in two. Then you have 2 plants, and then you just plant them both separately. Okay. And then get the, let me tell you, best thing to do is after you've trimmed the plant is dunk it in water and get the roots kind of wet where they kind of turn green because they're more malleable and you can move them around without breaking them. Because if you take a plant that's got the roots are dry like this and you start shoving them in a pot, you're probably going to crack them and break them and all that stuff. So after you trim it or whatever, dunk it in some water, spray it with some water, let the roots, you saw what happened when they sprayed Bill's plant there, how the roots turn green. Once they turn green, they're more malleable and you can move them around. Okay. If you have like a Cattleya or something like that, you might need to put a pot stake in there to hold it down. If you take one of those Cattleyas after you put it in the pot, you should be able to pick the whole thing up from the leaves. If you've got it staked in the pot well enough. Don't forget to label or relabel, because usually after 4 or 5 years or whatever, the plastic starts getting brittle and falling apart. Now's the time to relabel them. And I keep a list of, I have a spreadsheet. When I get a plant, I put the name and all that kind of stuff on a spreadsheet and I save it. But sometimes they get a little bit hard to read. Excuse me. And if you have a spreadsheet, you can go back and, oh, that's what that is. And then you know how to spell it out. Other things, like we said, you can attach them to a piece of wood or bark. Usually you might have to put a little bit of sphagnum moss on it, put the plant on it, wrap it with some bell wire or something like that. Get it going or stick it in a basket. Usually on these things, if you get a small van and a pot, you might be able to just stick the whole thing in the basket and it's going to grow the roots where it wants to grow them anyhow. So we meet the 3rd Sunday of every month except December. Follow us on Facebook or our OOS page. And our next show is Mother's Day weekend. Any questions?
So tell us, you had damage to your greenhouse, percentage wise, how much did you lose because of the frost?
A lot of the leaves are all dying and I'm picking them off and cleaning them up. And I'll have to see once that happens, what happens with the pseudobulbs. So yeah. Yes, Keith.
All I've ever read, just like he said, the temperature range like fanning off 55 to 85, etc. Of course, in the fall, to get the cool period, I let mine go down to 55, 50 for 3 weeks. Then I close up the greenhouse because I know they're warmer growing. But every year I do have a sudden I'll have I have a lot of stands I need to straighten up. I've got an office. And they'll make buds every once in a while, they'll turn, you know, the bud will not get big, it'll turn yellow. Blight, what's up?
Bud blast.
Bud blast, right. And I never know, what is it? It's because, is it the water I'm giving it, which is at room temperature, is still too cold? Or is it because they're fanning off if they really want to stay at above 60 once they've gone through the cold period? If they go down to 55, won't they lose more bud blast, or is that not it?
I think it's rapid changes in temperature, isn't it, that causes that?
There's can be many causes. It can be a plant got too dry while it was developing flower buds, or it got colder than it wanted. There's multiple reasons for bud blast. As far as Phalaenopsis flower initiation, 68 is the magic number. So they don't have to go down into the 50s to initiate flower spikes. 68 is the magic spot. So
68 is the cool temperature.
yep, that's as cool as they need, and that'll trigger floral initiation.
At night. That's warmer than I keep my greenhouse in the winter.
So 55 is colder than a Phalaenopsis.
Well, I know, but they did initiate spike.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm saying they're at spike now, and then I say, must I keep it obviously above 60? Now you're telling me 68, I go, I'm out of the game.
I have to tell you one little story though, at my house, in fact, I'd asked Douglas about this, probably been 2 years ago now. I had a bunch of my different kinds, Phalaenopsis, paths, came into bud, and it's like all of them turned brown and blasted. I'm like, what in the world? I had changed the temperature in my house, you know, we have carbon monoxide, all that kind of stuff. What I'm almost certain, because I changed it and it stopped, we were burning these Yankee candles because I love the fragrance. It was whatever oils I think were getting out in the atmosphere. In fact, when I had my kitchen painted, the painters, I said, yeah, I've also wondered what the little gray haziness is from those stupid candles we have down here. So I tried doing that, and apparently the things that you plug into the wall don't do that. But yeah, burning fragrance candles. Yeah, and so I quit, and it was like a whole bunch of them blasted. It was shocking.
And I mean, not the whole year. And you
Yes, almost 2 years.
Any questions from our people in Zoom?